The last few weeks have shown that journalism is just so important. We need to value journalists. There's an erosion of press freedom as destroying democracy, but it will go on to destroy other democracies.
That was award-winning journalist Shaunagh Connaire. This is Irish Stew. My name is Martin Nutty, and
I'm John Lee. And Martin, as that clip indicates, we're really going to take a dive into a vital global conversation today, the role of journalism. And I don't think we could have a better guide than the host of the Media Tribe podcast. This episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by Irish Examiner USA, a great source for Irish-centric news from both sides of the pond. Politics, business, sports, nightlife, arts and culture, and more. It's all at irishexaminerusa.com. Hey, welcome everyone to Irish Stew, Conversation for the Global Irish Nation. This is John Lee, the co-host of Irish Stew, and I'm speaking to you from New York City, where our co-host is, on the other side of town, Martin Nutty.
Hey, John, great to be back on the podcast, and I'm delighted to have Shaunagh Connaire on the podcast today. Shaunagh works in the domain of the journalism world, and she is a producer, a director, and also an award-winning journalist, and has worked for BBC, Channel 4, CNBC, the Financial Times, PBS, and operated in some interesting geographic locations, which include China, Iran, Sierra Leone. And currently, on her latest gig, she's the host of Media Tribe, a podcast about journalists and the work that they do. So welcome, Shaunagh. Delighted to have you on.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you for inviting me on. It's a real pleasure.
I just wanted to see if that description of Media Tribe was actually correct. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, you did a pretty good job there, Martin. Yes, the Media Tribe is a podcast and kind of a mini venture that I've started, all in a bid to restore the audience's faith in journalism, in our craft. And so what I'm trying to do on that podcast is showcase the integrity that's involved in journalism and the hard graft that's involved in getting the big stories out there. So as you said, I'm interviewing some of the world's most respected journalists, filmmakers, and media executives and hearing from them and the stories they've covered over the years. I guess another aim of the podcast as well is to inspire the next generation. It does often feel like a daunting space to enter. It's a tricky one to navigate, especially when you don't have the contacts and you might not have the right accent and you might not look the part. So I am hoping that the podcast will encourage young people to pursue journalism and not be not to shy away from this industry.
Shaunagh, I think that's such a great aim right now, and maybe we'll talk about it as the episode goes on. Journalism under attack, both kind of financially and politically, but there's just been great journalism done in times of crisis like we are in right now. So great mandate to elevate the craft.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much.
So what we like to do, Shaunagh, on this podcast is sometimes to trace the arc of our guest's career. And I know you're from Longford originally. So tell me a little bit about those Longford origins. It's one of the Midland counties in Ireland. And is that a hotbed of journalism?
Would you believe it actually is a hotbed of journalism? Many great journalists come from Longford. I've had one of them, at least, on my podcast, a man called Peter Gagan. I grew up in Longford. My parents actually are from Galway and Sligo, but somehow we ended up in Longford. I attended a convent there. That's where I went to school. I ended up going to University College Dublin, UCD, to study French and commerce. So didn't quite go into journalism from the get-go and ended up training as an accountant, actually, with KPMG in Dublin off the back of doing that degree. But about 2 years into my accounting career, I kind of I guess I lost faith and realized this really isn't what I wanted to do. So I broke the mold. I sold my little green Ford Fiesta, took out a loan, and I headed to London, where I'd been accepted onto a master's in journalism in Goldsmiths University. And there I did a year in journalism and was lucky enough to be one of the students chosen to do an internship at the BBC. But back to your Longford question, I really, really do feel like my Longford roots played a huge part in where I ended up. Sometimes I refer to us as an underdog county. And I think that feeling of sometimes being an underdog led me to representing the underdog in many of the films and stories that I've done.
Excellent. I'd like to take you back to KPMG for a second. I was listening to I was listening to one of your interviews with Malachi Brown and from the New York Times, a great, I'll call him a data journalist. There's probably a better term, but you asked him if his engineering degree was ever helpful at times. So in journalism, is that business side, that accounting side, does that ever serve you well later on in your journalism career?
Absolutely. And you mentioned in the intro that I've worked for the Financial Times most recently and also CNBC. So yeah, I did. I really used that accounting and finance experience when I was starting off in my career. I used that as my ticket to get jobs and get internships. I used to cold email many's an executive and say, I'm an accountant turned journalist itching to break into investigative journalism. And I would never attach my CV or anything like that. But I knew that line always kind of piqued people's interest because at that time it was 2009. So, we were experiencing the credit crunch and the financial crisis. So not a lot of people spoke that language and kind of understood that world. So I absolutely used that to my advantage. And I mean, gosh, with every story I do and every film that I make, there's often a follow the money thread. So it's great that I can read a balance sheet, I can read a P&L, and I love that element as well. I find it fascinating. So yeah, I absolutely use that. Why not?
Very good, very good.
Well, can you balance a checkbook? That's what I want to know.
Well, gosh, I say all this. You should see the state of my bank account right now. But yes, I probably could.
Now, obviously, you pick up sticks from Dublin, head off to London, to Goldsmiths for a year. And then I think the following year, you fetch up in BBC. So that's a pretty big leap in a matter of a couple of years. You're gone from being an accountant to working in probably one of the most preeminent news organizations in the world. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, I would say from the get-go, I am that kind of type of person that's politely annoying in the sense that I got the internship at the BBC. I was, I think, one of 4 picked in our class to do that. And it was all down to, I guess being seen as a hard worker as opposed to anybody exceptionally talented or anything like that. But I did my internship, I think it was a couple of months, working for free. And I was working in a bar as well then at the same time in London. And after the internship, I called either on the phone or physically to the BBC every other day and essentially begged them for a job. And I became that annoying that they succumbed under the pressure and eventually gave me a 3-week paid contract as a researcher on world debates. And I actually attribute that to a great Irish man in the BBC called Maurice Hartnett and his wife, Kerry Clark, who is the BBC head of world features. So they kind of, I guess they believed in me in a sense, and they gave me gigs on BBC World News on the news desk there, and then at Hard Talk. And after that 3-week stint, I somehow landed a role as a producer, and they sent me off to the States, and I traveled. I think I did like maybe 7 or 8 states in 2 weeks, and I was interviewing the world's kind of great digital minds at the time. So Eric Schmidt from Google and Steve Ballmer from Microsoft and people like that. So it was, and I really was making it up as I go along. Let me tell you, I did not have a clue what I was doing, but we got there in the end, and it actually ended up being a really nice little series that aired on BBC World Television, the radio, and online as well. So yeah, it worked out in the end, but genuinely all down to hard work. Definitely nothing special about my talents after Goldsmiths.
Well, there's a talent there in that politely annoying skill that you surface there. I looked at one thing in your background. I saw that Digital Giants, the one-person crew. Were you out there doing camera, lighting, sound, that sort of thing?
No, yeah, so that was the series, but no, I actually was really fortunate to travel with two other guys from the BBC. So yeah, I think that was probably because from there, obviously, I went to Channel 4, and then we were down to a two-man team. So right. I think I started off maybe in a different sphere than it is now. You certainly do everything now yourself, which is no harm, of course.
And then what got you onto the other side of the camera?
Yeah, well, I kind of used the same approach to get into Channel 4. After several years at News, I kind of felt slightly disillusioned in the sense that I really wanted to go deeper into stories. And I knew the reason I'd entered journalism in the first place was because I wanted to pursue investigations. And so I kind of mildly stalked the Channel 4 Unreported World team, and that's their Foreign Affairs series. It's a real prestigious series there. And I eventually got to the commissioner and pitched her an idea over coffee. And she gave me a job as the junior producer there and then. And I think I made 32 films as the junior producer. So that involved setting up really complex films in hostile environments like, Yemen and Somalia and Syria and places like that. And after 32 films, they asked me to do a screen test and to see if I'd be any good on camera. And I guess I got lucky there as well. And my first film on camera was I covered the Ebola epidemic in Sierra Leone in 2014, and actually we were the first film crew, myself and my director, to do that. And that film actually was bought by PBS Frontline as well, so we co-partnered with them, and it really did go on to have a huge impact in the sense that it really shone a light on a story that hadn't really been covered in that way before, in the sense that we weren't just talking about statistics. We very much covered a family story and took our audience to a corner of the world that they weren't familiar with, but by the end of our film, they could relate to, because we essentially just showed a family being torn apart by this awful, awful virus. So yeah, that's how I did that. And then they kept kind of employing me, luckily, and I made several more films on camera for Channel 4 Unreported World.
Speaking about that particular Ebola film, it's incredibly poignant. But I wonder, was there many volunteers that wanted to go into the Ebola zone itself? Was that how you got in front of the camera?
As in, are you implying that colleagues might not have desired that gig?
Well, frankly, I'm let's say I'm a little cautious. I'm, all locked down in New York City because of COVID, and COVID looks like a tea party compared to an Ebola outbreak.
Yeah. Well, no, I actually pitched it myself. So I kind of went in with my eyes open, wanting to do a hard-hitting story. And I guess because it was the first one I was doing as a reporter, I wanted it to be, pave the way for other stories I did, in the sense that it was a very serious story and a story where we wanted to have impact. But no, you're dead right. I mean, at the time, the death rate was 70%. So if you contracted Ebola, you only had a 30% chance of surviving. So it was dangerous. But, delighted we did it. It really, the CDC even went on to use our film. I think they picked up a couple of 100 copies to send over to health workers in West Africa to help educate them. So for me personally, journalism and linking journalism to impact is really important. So that was a good result in that sense.
Shaunagh, let's talk about the Ebola episode, the Ebola film, and kind of what it says and what it means about journalism now. I saw in some remarks of yours that you were going to leave journalism with a very leave journalism school or your early career, with the emotions very much in check, the way a lot of journalism has been done, and it looked like Ebola kind of had that experience took you out of that frame of mind, and those emotions became part of the story.
Yeah, it's actually quite a difficult question because sometimes I wonder, was that right? Do you know what I mean? Because obviously our aim is to remain objective and be impartial, and I genuinely just found it very hard not to be emotionally involved in that film when you're looking at kids dying every single day and little pediatric body bags arriving at the Médecins Sans Frontières clinic or Doctors Without Borders, as they call it in the States, arrive every day. It is so hard to remain detached. And I definitely struggled with that. And, I sometimes question if that was the right approach. But I think for me, empathy and using empathy as a tool in journalism is actually a good thing. And it's kind of relates to my point earlier. It's how do we get the audience on board and how do we get the audience to care? And I think empathy is a great tool in that sense. I sometimes think it's good to be a human being first and a journalist second. I'm sure many people don't agree with that approach, but that's what we did, and it was a good film and an important one at the time.
Well, I'd like to go back, take your comment back to Longford, because I picked up somewhere along the line your, as far as empathy, your discussion of your mom and the empathy she showed to people also kind of displaced internationally and globally. And that seemed to have a big influence on you and also maybe established a bit of a comfort zone for you to jump into these areas that most people would kind of run away from.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. I did a TEDx talk about that actually, and my mother probably was mortified off the back of it. But anyway, but I did talk about her mum's empathy as well, and my mum's empathy, and I referred to being young in Longford, growing up, and my mum and dad used to mind kids from Chernobyl who had really, really sad lives in Belarus. And they used to stay with us during the summer. And I guess, it nearly was a masterclass in empathy at the time. I kind of just assumed they were my cousins or something. Actually, one of them looked very like me. But it was great in the sense that, we were, I guess in some ways put out of our comfort zone. We had to share all our things and give up our bedrooms and, give up our bicycles and stuff like that to people we didn't know who didn't speak our language. And we had to kind of find ways to communicate with these lovely, lovely girls who really were fantastic. And I think that it really taught me a lot back then. I obviously didn't realize at the time what my parents were probably trying to do, but it was important. And gosh, so many families in Longford did the same thing. It wasn't just us at all. It was we were part of a cohort. I think I also referenced, moments when we were younger. My mum also did a lot of kind of volunteering and she used to try and raise money for various different parts of the world. And I remember Somalia being a place which was spoken about a lot in our house. And it was, of course, during the famine times. And my uncle actually, who's also a journalist and a real inspiration of mine, his name is Paddy Clancy. He used to work at RT. He did the morning, or what it says in the papers in the morning broadcast. And he had headed over to Somalia himself with Mary Robinson. And we were all very, very inspired by him. And I think that's what got my mum to do all her fundraising. And of course, we would end up counting all the pennies on the floor in our kitchen. So yeah, all of those were great lessons, I guess. At the time we just thought this was completely normal behavior. But yeah, I think it was great.
Shaunagh, one other thing on the Ebola project, and I believe this came out in the TED Talk, because we talked a little bit earlier about some of the pressures journalists are under today. I was just really struck by your story of being caught in a riot in a nearby town because people were attacking a hospital because they believed that Ebola was a hoax. And given the things we've seen in the United States with the connection of COVID and the myth of the hoax around COVID, I was really struck by that.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you put it like that. Yeah, we did. We traveled to a hospital in a place called Kenema, which is about 3 hours west of Kailaun, where we were based, right at the border of Liberia and Guinea. And we really just traveled to this hospital. It was a place where I think something like 40 of the medical staff had died from Ebola. And we wanted to showcase, how serious that situation was. And, we couldn't touch anything in the place. We just wanted to film it because everything was so contagious. And just as we were leaving the hospital, we were leaving in our van, and something felt so off. And we just left the gates, and we just saw a mob of people running up the street. Some of them had sticks. It all looked a little bit scary, and they were shouting, "Foreigners had brought Ebola." And of course, we were two foreigners sitting in the car. And anyway, we got out to kind of document that. And a lot of people told us that, yes, they thought, what was being reported as well on the radio was that Ebola was a hoax. It's a lie. And it's, as I said, something that foreigners had brought in. And it really, really does. It's not too different to what we're seeing now, and how, social media is being used to, portray this disinformation and fake news. So yeah, that's a really, really good point, actually.
You've obviously traveled to some fairly interesting places over the years. And I'm just kind of curious, does it help to carry an Irish passport? Does that give you a different kind of entree than, let's say, if you were carrying an American passport or something else?
100%. Yes. I can tell you a story. When I went to Iran, I genuinely think the only reason we got in was because we were Irish. It took us months to kind of push the visa forward. And I was talking to, our wonderful local producer in Iran, who was kind of lobbying his people on the Tehran side. And then I was lobbying people on the Dublin side. And I traveled with the director from Belfast, who also is Irish. But when we actually got there, all of the access that we got was based on being Irish. It was extraordinary. We had a government minder, obviously. They were kind of watching our every move. But he used to introduce us and say, they know Bobby Sands, and you guys will know he was IRA hunger striker, or these guys know Robbie Keane or other Irish soccer players. So the Iranians really... I guess they connect with Ireland, and they would say, oh yes, Bobby was a martyr, like, some of our Iranian fighters during the Iran-Iraq war. So yeah, being Irish has helped me so much, I would say. Also in Lebanon was pretty much the same thing. We had a few run-ins with Hezbollah, and it's always good to know you have an Irish passport in your pocket to take out if necessary. No offense to Americans. My little baby has an American passport, which we're delighted with. But yeah, it is really, really great to hold an Irish passport. It certainly helps you get into countries that others perhaps couldn't get into.
Well, it's a good thing that to have a passport from a country that never invaded anybody else. So.
Yes.
The Ebola story is a story that kind of displayed you in a more emotionally connected way. And then I also noticed that you've done some interesting work in both China and with Middle Eastern refugees coming into Europe, specifically that belong to the LGBT community. And I'm curious as to what drove that. Was that the underreported stories again, and you felt like that wasn't getting the appropriate coverage?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that was part of Unreported World. And, the title says it all. We try and do stories that nobody else will touch. So the China story was an undercover assignment, which was a tricky one, where we traveled into China and tried to expose clinics that were offering electric shock therapy as a so-called cure for homosexuality. So that involved a lot of secret filming. In the end, the Chinese knew we were there. It all got very hairy very quickly, and we had to leave quite quickly. But that ended up being a very good film as well. I mean, we showed with prima facie evidence that this kind of conversion therapy was still taking place. And then, yes, again, with LGBT refugees escaping places like Iraq and Syria because of their sexuality. We were able to tell their story from Germany, which is actually, you think Germany, oh, that's an easy place to tell a story from, but it actually was a very tricky story to tell as well, because a lot of these guys, they were so fearful of their lives because they were still in communities where people, view homosexuality as a huge sin, and they received, a lot of abuse because of that. But I think, I think that film was quite a. Yeah, it was a good one, and it was also a very timely one. And for context, it was Angela Merkel had let in 1 million refugees, and it was all very controversial. And various kind of attacks were taking place across Europe. So I felt like these LGBT refugees were kind of facing so many horrors, not just trying to cover up their sexuality in front of some people from their own community, but also, being a refugee in countries where a small minority were creating havoc was very, very difficult for them. And, some of them, I mean, gosh, when I think back, Rami, for example, a really, really young guy, like the tales he tells you about, getting the boat across from Izmir, I think it was, and, the treacherous journeys that they face, and then they're left all alone in Germany trying to navigate their way. I think it was a good film. It was a very, very hard one to make as well. I think just getting access and getting people to feel comfortable and talk about their stories can sometimes be tricky.
Yeah, was a gut-wrenching story when I think you have some film where he just hears that a friend of his has been murdered as a result of the fact that his friend was gay, and obviously you were there for that. And it was, terribly sad. But what I'm interested in here is that obviously there's these strange analogies between Ebola and the United States and COVID. And again, you're talking about gay conversion therapy in China, and it's not that long removed since that's been used in the United States. And indeed, I'm guessing it probably still is. And I wonder to what degree these stories, even though that they're made in exotic locations, are basically still holding up a mirror to Western society. Was that ever kind of part of the agenda?
Well, back then, maybe not, but now that feels relevant. I mean, kind of back to your previous point about hoaxes and conspiracy theories. Yeah, it feels totally relevant now. But back then, no, it really wasn't. But certainly now, gosh, I can, draw many parallels. I also did a film about abortion in Ireland, and that was in 2017. So just before the referendum in 2018. And of course, what we see here now as well, that a film like that would be very relevant to make here in the United States. It's very sad and disturbing to see the regression across Western democracies and what's taking place now. It's scary, and it's a real shame that journalists are being viewed in the way in which they're being viewed and called enemies of the state by our current leader. I think many of the films I've made over the years in, as you say, kind of foreign countries, you could certainly make them here for sure.
Shaunagh, as you're kind of getting into the state of journalism today, are we in the best of times or the worst of times?
Well, I would say I am an optimist, and I think we are navigating tricky territory and tricky waters. But I think, there's such a will amongst journalists I certainly know and have worked with to really get the big stories out there. There's such an appetite for that. And you can see many newsrooms across the country really innovating to try and reach different audiences and do things differently. I mean, you mentioned Malachy Brown from the New York Times and his visual investigations team. What they do is absolutely the best form of journalism in my opinion now. So when you see what stories they're able to cover and kind of what they're able to prove via their forensic investigations, that gives me great hope that the future is bright for journalism. Of course, many outlets are facing financial worries, but I mean, another lady I had on my podcast, Varsha Sharma, who's the managing editor of Now This, they're one of the kind of new digital native platforms, but they're actually experiencing growth, and they just, they're diversifying and they're finding new ways to reach their very, very young audience. So it's, we're certainly facing tricky times, but I'm an optimist and we need journalism. I think the last few weeks have shown that journalism is just so important. We need to value journalists. I've actually just released an episode with Maria Ressa, who you'll know from Rappler, who's the extraordinary woman who is being targeted by the Filipino government. And, back in 2016, she was telling us all about disinformation and how there's an erosion of press freedom and how it's destroying not just the Philippines as a democracy, but it will go on to destroy other democracies if we don't pay heed. And of course, what we've just seen in the capital, she called that out. But at least we have people like her and her colleagues at Rappler doing that. So yeah, I'm optimistic.
And to put this in perspective, we're talking to Shaunagh a day or two after the storming of the Capitol building. So all of these, the idea of people enraged by a hoax and the attacks on journalism, which were quite visible, and physical, and damaging over that assault on the Capitol. So just to have our listeners know the time frame we're talking about when we recorded this.
Can I just shift forward? Now you're living in New York and you're doing a podcast. So how does that fit into the overall framework of your career?
I mean, it's hard to know. I would say, yes, I'm in New York. Very exciting times. I moved over here with the Financial Times. But I'm now doing the Media Tribe as a bootstrapped production myself. It's something I really, really believe in. It's something that I feel is necessary. I wouldn't say it was a grand plan in terms of the career trajectory, but it's something that was certainly in the back of my mind that I wanted to do. And, I'm always kind of looking to learn new skills and do things differently. So I'd never actually done audio before. So here we are, and it seems to be hitting a nerve with many. So I'm going to continue doing that. But I'm currently pregnant. So, and I've just had a baby towards the end of 2019. So it's been hectic in that perspective. And I think, being a mum in media is sometimes a tricky territory to navigate as well. So I'm figuring that part out. And, but no, I mean, I've quite a few more plans up my sleeve that will probably happen after the next baby, all going well. So watch this space.
Shaunagh, you like to take on a challenge. We're hearing you.
Yes, exactly.
When you're, it's a kind of a different role now. You're interviewing the interviewers, you're interviewing the journalists, and when you're talking to them, and also kind of as a from the podcast producer standpoint, which Martin and I look at, can you hear the aha moment? Is there some point in the interview where something pops out and you can kind of hear a change in in your interviewee's voice? The pace is picking up. There's excitement. Do you hear those kind of aha moments as you're going along?
Yeah, definitely. I think my approach is very informal. So, when you're interviewing some of the most high profile journalists across the world, they often have to, when they're delivering their news, have a certain type of composure and and in some ways have a very straight face. But when they come on the Media Tribe podcast, it's like having a quick pint in the pub down the road. So it's really informal, and it's really lovely to hear them open up and be willing to speak candidly about, not only the challenges that they faced in their career, but also kind of the crazy moments. That's one question I asked them at the very end, just to be a bit lighthearted, but crazy experiences they've had along the way. And because I know, that our world is slightly bonkers. I know they will always provide the goods. So I've had people tell me, Jon Snow from Channel 4, who's iconic in the UK, told me that he once was on a plane with the Ugandan dictator Idi Amin, and when Idi fell asleep, he actually contemplated killing him because he saw his gun in his pocket. So I'm not sure John would be telling saying that in Channel 4 News. And another really wonderful correspondent is Lise Doucette from the BBC, who's very, very well known. And she tells me about dressing up as a man to get access in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So all of these completely mental stories that would never make it to air otherwise, but I kind of coax them out of them towards the end of the interview when they're feeling vulnerable and very comfortable in the situation. So yeah, lots of aha moments on the Media Tribe podcast.
One that I noticed was your interview with Donnie O'Sullivan, who's become quite a cult figure.
Yeah, you can say that again.
He's a media favorite. And I was so happy to hear an Irish accent on CNN when he first showed up. It was such a great change of pace. But he was talking about his work in that sort of data investigative journalism. A lot of people talk about Storyful coming out of the Mark Little's operation. And he was talking about, he was looking at the Russian disinformation campaign in promoting the Trump campaign. If I have said that not too elegantly, but he began to realize that these same Russian forces were scattering disinformation all over the internet. They were starting Black Lives Matter groups. They were starting anti-Black Lives Matter groups. They were just sowing discord. And I could hear in that when he was on your podcast, he's sort of like kind of realizing, whoa, this thing is much, much bigger than we thought.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, Donnie is a fantastic journalist and a friend here as well. And as you say, he's become quite the internet sensation this week in Ireland, especially, and so well deserved. He's worked incredibly hard to get that story out there. But yeah, I think what you hear in Donnie's interview on the Media Tribe podcast is actually just the passion and how much conviction he has in his own work. And his beat is so on point right now. It's not even funny. So fair play to him. And, his reporting on CNN has really been so standout. Actually, he's on the Late Late Show tonight, so we'll all have to go and watch that somehow. But yeah, the man is a legend. Was delighted that he came on the podcast. We had a bit of crack.
So, Shaunagh, I know you're a little pressed for time, so we'll start to wrap this up. But before we let you go, I'm just curious, do you have like a particular inspirational figure that drives you forward? And could you tell me a little bit about that?
Do you mean from a journalistic perspective?
Can be whatever you like.
Oh, gosh, that's a hard one. That is very, very hard. I guess I'm really inspired by female leaders and people that are willing to break the mold and go against the grain, even when it feels very daunting to do so. I love working with people who have backbone and are not afraid to stick it to the bully and hold power to account, even if it causes very uncomfortable conversations and situations. I'm really inspired by those people, and they're the kind of people I want to work with. And I've worked with so many people like that over the years, and it's been a real privilege. Really, really some of the best in the industry in that respect. Channel 4 in particular really, really stands out. But I think really that's what inspires me, is kind of seeing people's courage to as I say, go against the grain and call bad behavior out. That really, really does inspire me, and I kind of hope to do the same myself.
Well, we can see that lives on in your work. And Shaunagh, you were so great to be generous with your time here today for us. So we'd like to give you a chance to make a shameless plug. Is anything in your world you'd like people to know about and get in touch with, perhaps your podcast or a cause you're involved with? We'd be happy to give you a platform.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And honestly, it's a real pleasure to come on your podcast. You've actually just made me quite hungry for Irish stew now. It's been quite a while since I've had any. But I would love to plug the podcast. It's called Media Tribe. It's available on all the usual podcast apps or thismediatribe.com. We've several episodes up there at the moment, all covering very, very different topics. Get in touch with me also on social media if you want to suggest guests. I very much encourage that. But yeah, go and download and subscribe to my podcast. That would be awesome.
Well, great. We'll leave all the information in our show notes.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Shaunagh. Really enjoyed it. And again, folks, Media Tribe is the podcast that you should be subscribing to. And of course, Irish Stew. John, I really enjoyed that conversation with Shaunagh, and I'm curious as to what your takeaways were from this conversation.
Sure, Martin, I'm with you on that. It's the name of her podcast, but I really got a sense for Shaunagh as a member of the Media Tribe. From her start in accounting, she found her way to her real tribe in journalism. And with her Media Tribe podcast, she's helping connect the Media Tribe by providing a great forum for global conversation. And that idea of global conversation, that sounds somewhat familiar to me here on Irish Stew.
Yeah, and I think Shaunagh, during our conversation, actually showed her conversational chops. It's like an Irish superpower. Shaunagh clearly laid out how leveraging that conversation ability, no doubt honed in some of the finer public establishments of Ireland, enables her to draw out her journalistic colleagues so that you get that one thing that you really want to get in a podcast, an aha moment. And those aha moments can only ever happen when you make people relaxed.
And one other thing, Martin, you and I spoke before we spoke with Shaunagh. We had a conversation about her work, and we had this sense of bearing witness. You being the more erudite member of Irish Stew, you related that sense of bearing witness to the Quaker faith. Whereas I thought of a Fantastic Four comic book character, the Watcher, an intergalactic wanderer who seemed to change the course of events for the better just by observing them, just by bearing witness.
I'm going to defer to your pop culture cred there, and I'll reluctantly take on the sobriquet of erudite. But I think this is a great conversation, and just want to thank the listeners for downloading us and learning a little bit more about Shaunagh and her excellent podcast, Media Tribe. Hey folks, thanks for listening. If you like what we're doing, please leave a review on your podcast platform of choice. And
if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts and aren't sure of how to post a review, we explain it all in our blog at irishstewpodcast.com.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.